At the beginning of the Cold War, when the world was still breathing the heavy air left behind by the Second World War, the Soviet Union understood that the next confrontation between great powers would not be fought solely through ideology, but through presence, power projection, and naval demonstration. It was within this atmosphere of strategic reconstruction that a ship emerged which would become a symbol of historical transition. Yakov Sverdlov, the lead ship of the powerful Sverdlov-class cruiser, officially known as Project 68 bis. To understand Yakov Sverdlov, it is necessary to return to the final years of World War II. The Soviet Navy had suffered significant losses and, although it played an important role in coastal operations and ground support, it lacked an ocean-going fleet comparable to those of the major maritime powers. Soviet leadership, particularly under Joseph Stalin, believed that the future required a navy capable of operating beyond the confined waters of the Baltic and Black Seas. The objective was no longer purely defensive, it was to project power. Project 68 bis was the direct evolution of Project 68K, itself derived from earlier Soviet light cruiser concepts developed before the war. Lessons learned during the global conflict were clear. Greater operational range was needed, along with stronger anti-aircraft protection, improved radar systems, and more effective fire control technology. The result was a robust cruiser with classic lines, yet born firmly into the age of naval electronics. Yakov Sverdlov was constructed at the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad, a city still bearing the deep scars of the German siege. Her keel was laid in 1949, she was launched in 1950, and officially commissioned into the Soviet Navy in 1952. The ship was named after Yakov Mikhailovich Sverdlov, a prominent Bolshevik leader and close associate of Lenin who died in 1919. The naming was not merely symbolic, it was ideological. Each vessel of the class carried names reinforcing Soviet revolutionary identity. Technically, Yakov Sverdlov represented the pinnacle of the traditional gun-armed cruiser concept. Displacing roughly 16,000 tons at full load and measuring about 210 meters in length, she could reach speeds exceeding 32 knots, powered by steam turbines fed by high-pressure boilers. Her silhouette was both elegant and imposing. 3 triple turrets armed with 152mm guns dominated the main deck, 2 forward and 1 aft, capable of delivering devastating surface salvos. Yet the world was already changing. When Yakov Sverdlov entered service, guided missiles were beginning to transform naval warfare. Aircraft carriers and submarines were gaining increasing strategic dominance. Still, within early 1950s Soviet naval doctrine, cruisers like her remained essential. They were intended to lead formations, protect convoys, support amphibious operations, and above all represent the Soviet flag in international waters. Internally, the ship functioned as a floating city. Her crew exceeded 1,200 personnel, officers, engineers, radar operators, gunners, and sailors living in relatively confined but strictly organized conditions. The Soviet Navy placed strong emphasis on technical preparedness, and Yakov Sverdlov also served as an advanced training platform. Every exercise conducted in the Baltic Sea or North Atlantic formed part of a broader strategic goal, transforming the Soviet fleet into a respected and feared maritime force. Her radar and fire control systems were modern for their time. Sverdlov-class cruisers incorporated air search and surface search radar alongside dedicated targeting systems for anti-aircraft batteries. These features reflected hard lessons learned during World War II, when air attacks had proven devastating to inadequately protected ships. Yakov Sverdlov carried numerous automatic anti-aircraft guns, including 100mm and 37mm weapons, forming a dense defensive shield against aerial threats. However, a quiet strategic tension was embedded within her very existence. She was simultaneously a symbol of modernization and one of the last great representatives of an era dominated by heavy naval artillery. While she sailed through exercises and demonstrations of strength, the United States was already investing heavily in carrier battle groups and emerging nuclear submarines. The technological race was only beginning. During her early years of service, Yakov Sverdlov primarily participated in Baltic exercises and diplomatic port visits designed to project Soviet presence abroad. These missions were as political as they were military. Every port call, naval parade, and public appearance reinforced the image of a resurgent Soviet Union determined to compete on the global stage. Yet the ship's true importance extended beyond operational service. As the lead vessel of the Sverdlov-class, she established the standard for all sister ships that followed. Engineering decisions, internal organization, and installed systems aboard her served as reference points for subsequent construction. She functioned as the operational prototype of a fleet intended to restore Soviet maritime prestige. And still, behind her thick steel hull and gleaming gun turrets, a strategic dilemma was already emerging. The Soviet Union was investing enormous resources in conventional gun cruisers at precisely the moment naval warfare was entering the guided missile age. This choice reflected intense internal debates about the future of the fleet, debates that would become even more pronounced after Stalin's death in 1953. Yakov Sverdlov sailed not only across oceans, but through a moment of historical transition. Conceived under the logic of World War II, she operated at the dawn of the nuclear Cold War. She carried guns representing decades of naval tradition while the future pointed toward rockets and nuclear warheads. And it is at this point that her story begins to grow even more complex, because the fate of the lead ship of the Sverdlov-class would become deeply intertwined with internal political change within the Soviet Union and the complete redefinition of Soviet naval strategy in the decades that followed. As the 1950s progressed, Yakov Sverdlov solidified its position as one of the principal cruisers of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. The waters surrounding Leningrad were both strategic and highly sensitive. Every Soviet naval movement in the Baltic Sea was closely monitored by NATO navies. Its proximity to Western Europe transformed the region into a tense maritime arena, where naval exercises served not only military purposes but also unmistakable political messages. Yakov Sverdlov frequently operated as a flagship during large-scale maneuvers. Its presence was not merely technical, it was symbolic. Stretching more than 200 meters in length, with three triple 152mm gun turrets dominating the horizon and radar-filled masts rising above the superstructure, the cruiser embodied the rebirth of Soviet naval power after the devastation of World War II and the hardships of reconstruction. At that time, Soviet naval doctrine still placed significant value on heavily armed gun cruisers. These ships were expected to support amphibious landings in the Baltic, ensure regional naval superiority, and serve as the core of surface combat groups. In the event of war with NATO, vessels like Yakov Sverdlov would bombard coastal positions, engage enemy naval forces and protect strategic convoys. Yet profound changes were unfolding in Moscow. Following Stalin's death in 1953, Soviet leadership entered a period of political restructuring. Nikita Khrushchev, who would soon emerge as the dominant figure in Soviet politics, held a markedly different vision of future warfare. In his view, Soviet military strength should focus on ballistic missiles and strategic nuclear forces. Large surface warships increasingly came to be regarded as expensive, vulnerable, and potentially obsolete in the nuclear age. This shift in strategic thinking directly affected the Sverdlov-class cruisers. Expansion plans for additional gun cruisers were reduced or cancelled altogether, and several projected ships were never completed. As the lead ship of the class, Yakov Sverdlov remained in active service, but now operated within an increasingly uncertain strategic framework. While debates unfolded within the highest levels of government and naval command, life aboard the cruiser continued with discipline and intensity. The ship functioned as a complex mechanical organism. Steam turbines demanded constant maintenance. Boilers operated under extreme pressure. Gunnery exercises with the main batteries were conducted regularly, demonstrating impressive precision. A full salvo from the three 152mm turrets could launch 9 shells within seconds, each capable of inflicting severe damage against surface targets. Anti-aircraft crews also trained relentlessly. The growing threat posed by jet aircraft required rapid response capabilities. Radar operators spent long hours tracking simulated targets, while fire control officers coordinated ballistic calculations with mathematical accuracy. Every exercise became a choreography of steel, steam, and discipline. Yet an unavoidable question lingered: against whom would Yakov Sverdlov actually fight? In the early Cold War, direct confrontation between superpowers seemed possible at any moment. Crises such as those in Berlin heightened global tension. Nevertheless, open conflict never materialized. Instead, the Soviet Navy increasingly used its cruisers as instruments of strategic presence. Yakov Sverdlov participated in diplomatic visits and naval demonstrations designed to reinforce alliances and project Soviet power abroad. The ship also served prominently in official ceremonies and naval parades. These events were carefully orchestrated displays of authority. Sailors lined along the decks, immaculate uniforms, flags fully unfurled, every detail reinforcing an image of order, discipline, and strength. Meanwhile, naval technology continued advancing at remarkable speed. Nuclear submarines were redefining maritime balance. Anti-ship missiles emerged as a credible and growing threat. Gun-armed cruisers, once dominant symbols of sea power, increasingly appeared vulnerable to guided weapons capable of striking from hundreds of kilometers away. This technological transition created a paradox. Yakov Sverdlov remained robust, fast and heavily armed by late 1940s standards, yet the approaching 1960s introduced entirely new rules of naval warfare. Despite this, the cruiser continued to play an important role within Soviet naval structure. Its endurance allowed extended deployments. Its artillery retained value in coastal combat scenarios. And its very existence signaled that the Soviet Union possessed a surface fleet capable, at least symbolically, of rivaling Western navies. Behind the scenes, however, difficult decisions were beginning to take shape within the Kremlin and Naval Command. Maintaining large cruisers required enormous resources, fuel, maintenance infrastructure, and crews numbering in the thousands. In an era increasingly dominated by strategic missile forces, every ruble invested demanded justification. Gradually, Yakov Sverdlov, leader of its class, became a bridge between two naval eras, the age of heavy naval artillery and the emerging age of missile-guided warfare. And it would be precisely this strategic transformation, this fundamental shift in how maritime power was understood, that would determine the next chapter of its history. During the second half of the 1950s, Yakov Sverdlov was no longer simply a modern warship. It had become an institutional symbol within the Soviet Navy. As the lead ship of the Project 68 bis Sverdlov-class, its presence in naval exercises and ceremonial parades carried unmistakable political weight. Every public appearance in the Baltic Sea was closely monitored by Western military analysts. Photographs were taken from afar, silhouettes carefully studied, and detailed reports compiled in NATO offices. The Cold War was fought not only with weapons but with perception. Yakov Sverdlov regularly participated in combined maneuvers alongside destroyers, conventional submarines and auxiliary vessels. These operations rehearsed everything from convoy escort missions to simulated attacks against enemy surface forces. Armed with 12 152mm guns mounted in 4 triple turrets, the cruiser still represented formidable firepower. In a traditional fleet engagement, its ability to deliver rapid, coordinated salvos could prove devastating. Yet Soviet naval priorities were beginning to shift. Submarines, particularly the emerging nuclear-powered fleet, increasingly received strategic emphasis. The concept of denying maritime access to an adversary by threatening transatlantic supply lines became central to Soviet doctrine. Within this evolving framework, large surface cruisers gradually moved away from the core of operational strategy. Even so, Yakov Sverdlov remained relevant. It served as an advanced training platform for officers and gunnery crews, functioning as a fleet coordination school at sea. Above all, it continued to act as an instrument of diplomatic presence. In an era when every naval deployment carried geopolitical meaning, the mere arrival of a Soviet cruiser in a foreign port conveyed a deliberate strategic message. Life aboard the ship, however, reflected the realities of a vessel conceived in an earlier technological age. Its propulsion systems relied on complex networks of steam boilers and turbines requiring constant maintenance. Engine rooms operated under intense heat, and engineering crews worked long shifts to sustain operational readiness. On the bridge, officers monitored radar systems that, although modern in the early 1950s, were already beginning to show limitations as electronic warfare advanced rapidly during the following decade. Radar detection was becoming only one element within an increasingly complex environment of countermeasures, signal interference, and electronic deception. Another concern was becoming unavoidable: vulnerability. The introduction of anti-ship missiles represented an existential threat to ships like Yakov Sverdlov. Unlike traditional artillery shells, which required visual engagement and precise ballistic calculations, guided missiles could be launched from great distances using active or passive radar guidance. A single successful strike could critically damage a cruiser regardless of armor thickness. This new reality sparked internal debate within the Soviet Navy. Should the Sverdlov-class be modernized with missile systems? Converted into specialized platforms? Or accepted as transitional ships, valuable only until a new generation entered service? Some vessels of the class underwent modifications over time, and conversion projects were studied. However, Yakov Sverdlov, as the lead ship, largely retained its original heavy gun configuration. This was far from insignificant. Increasingly, it became a living representative of a fading naval philosophy. While aircraft carriers dominated Western oceans and nuclear submarines patrolled silently beneath the waves, Yakov Sverdlov continued to symbolize the power of classical naval artillery, a legacy of World War II adapted to the early Cold War. By the 1960s, its operational activity gradually declined compared to its early years. The cruiser still participated in exercises and official events but no longer occupied the strategic center of Soviet naval planning. Priorities shifted decisively toward strategic missile forces and submarine fleets. Yet the story of Yakov Sverdlov is not merely one of technological obsolescence. It is also a story of institutional continuity. The ship served for decades, navigating profound political transformations within the Soviet Union. It survived the Stalin era, operated under Khrushchev, and witnessed the consolidation of the Soviet Navy as a global ocean-going force in the years that followed. Every nautical mile traveled by its steel hull reflected the ambitions of a state determined to assert itself as a maritime superpower. Even as technology advanced beyond it, the ship remained tangible proof that the Soviet Union could design and build major surface combatants capable of projecting power worldwide. And as the decades passed, a quiet question began to emerge. What would ultimately become of a warship conceived at the height of naval artillery, yet sailing in a world increasingly dominated by missiles and nuclear weapons? The answer would involve not only technical decisions, but profound changes within the Soviet Union itself. Changes that would ultimately reshape the global naval balance. As the 1970s approached, Yakov Sverdlov was no longer at the technological forefront of the Soviet Navy, yet neither was it merely a floating relic. By this stage, it had become an established component of the Baltic Fleet, integrated into a navy that now operated guided missile cruisers, strategic nuclear submarines, and ocean-going anti-submarine warfare vessels. The Soviet Union itself had changed profoundly since Yakov Sverdlov first entered service. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had demonstrated just how close the world had come to nuclear war. In response, the Soviet Navy expanded its operational reach into the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and even the Indian Ocean. The strategic objective was unmistakable: to contain and challenge United States naval power across multiple theaters. Within this new reality, pure gun cruisers like Yakov Sverdlov occupied a secondary role. They could still perform support duties, training missions, and regional presence operations, but they were no longer central to Soviet deterrence strategy. True strategic power increasingly resided in submarine-launched ballistic missiles and missile-armed surface combatants capable of striking targets at long range. And yet, Yakov Sverdlov continued to sail. The cruiser participated in routine Baltic exercises, carried out representation missions, and maintained an active and disciplined crew. For many Soviet sailors, serving aboard a Sverdlov-class cruiser remained a source of pride. The ship was spacious by contemporary standards, comparatively comfortable when measured against smaller vessels, and its imposing silhouette still commanded attention wherever it appeared. Maintenance, however, became increasingly demanding. Systems designed in the late 1940s were showing the inevitable effects of age and operational wear. A full modernization would have required substantial investment, difficult to justify in a navy already directing resources toward more advanced missile platforms. Doctrine also played a decisive role. Heavy naval artillery, while still effective in limited scenarios such as coastal bombardment, lacked the strategic reach of guided missiles. A gun cruiser needed to approach relatively close to its target to engage effectively. In an environment dominated by carrier aviation and long-range anti-ship missiles, such proximity represented growing vulnerability. Throughout the 1970s, several ships of the Sverdlov-class began to be withdrawn from frontline service or reassigned. Some were converted into training ships. Others served in auxiliary roles. Yakov Sverdlov remained operational for a considerable period, but its combat relevance steadily declined. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union invested heavily in expanding its global navy, but that investment focused on new generations of warships, missile cruisers, modern destroyers, and nuclear-powered submarines. The future of naval warfare was technological, electronic, and increasingly automated. Yakov Sverdlov came to represent the closing chapter of a long naval tradition, the classic artillery cruiser, a direct descendant of the great surface fleets of the early 20th century. It stood as a historical bridge between two naval eras. Eventually, the decision became unavoidable. After decades of service, Yakov Sverdlov was decommissioned from the Soviet Navy. The process was gradual rather than sudden, part of the broader reduction of the class. Maintaining aging ships had become economically impractical, particularly as financial pressures on the Soviet state continued to grow. Its dismantling symbolically marked the end of a distinct phase in Soviet naval construction. This was not merely the retirement of a single ship, it was the conclusion of an entire doctrine. When Yakov Sverdlov was finally removed from active service and sent for scrapping, the career of the lead ship of one of the last major gun cruiser classes ever built came to an end. It did not fight decisive battles. It was not present at confrontations that reshaped world history. But its importance was structural. It embodied the Soviet effort to rebuild a surface fleet after the devastation of the Second World War. It served as the technical standard for a large class of cruisers. It projected strategic presence during the tense early decades of the Cold War. And perhaps most significantly, it sailed through an era of radical transformation, from conventional warfare to nuclear deterrence, from naval artillery to guided missiles, from direct confrontation to permanent geopolitical competition. The steel hull of Yakov Sverdlov may have been dismantled, but its story endures as a testament to a time when naval power was still measured by the caliber of guns and the imposing silhouettes that dominated the horizon. But to fully understand the significance of Yakov Sverdlov, it is necessary to move beyond the simple chronology of its service and examine its structural impact within Soviet naval strategy. The ship was not merely the first of its class. It became the operational model that helped consolidate an entire post-war philosophy of maritime power. Project 68 bis emerged at a moment when the Soviet Union sought strategic balance across all military domains. On land, the Red Army was massive and battle-hardened. In the air, Soviet aviation was advancing rapidly. At sea, however, a historical gap remained. Imperial Russia had never achieved lasting dominance as a naval power, and the Soviet Navy inherited deep structural limitations after the Second World War. The construction of Yakov Sverdlov symbolized a deliberate attempt to correct that weakness. Its design emphasized structural resilience. The hull was heavily compartmentalized to improve survivability after damage. Armor protection, while far lighter than that of a battleship, provided meaningful resistance against medium-caliber fire. The triple 152mm gun turrets could deliver sustained long-range fire with a high rate of accuracy, supported by integrated fire control systems that reflected wartime lessons learned only a few years earlier. Yet an even more important aspect lay beneath these technical details. The ship was designed for prolonged open-sea operations. This represented a decisive shift in Soviet naval thinking. The fleet was no longer conceived purely as a coastal defense force. It was beginning to imagine itself as an ocean-capable navy. During the 1950s, cruisers such as Yakov Sverdlov formed the backbone of Soviet surface power. They were capable of leading task groups, coordinating communications across formations, and maintaining sustained presence at sea. In fleet exercises, they frequently served as defensive and command centers against simulated enemy naval formations. At the same time, however, they became part of a broader strategic experiment. The Soviet Union needed to determine whether large conventional gun cruisers still had a place in the emerging nuclear age. Life aboard the ship reflected this silent dilemma. Gunnery exercises were conducted with meticulous precision. Combat simulations included evasive maneuvers against air attack. Damage control training was constant. Simulated fires, controlled flooding drills, and compartment isolation procedures. The institutional memory of the Second World War remained vivid within the Soviet Navy. But the global environment was changing rapidly. The proliferation of anti-ship missiles, both Soviet and Western, fundamentally altered the survivability calculations of surface warships. Ironically, the same technological innovations strengthening Soviet naval power also made ships like Yakov Sverdlov increasingly vulnerable. Weapons capable of destroying large cruisers could now be launched from hundreds of kilometers away. Despite this, the cruiser retained considerable political and institutional value. It trained generations of naval officers. It functioned as an advanced technical platform. It represented Soviet naval prestige during moments of national projection and diplomatic signaling. Throughout its career, Yakov Sverdlov witnessed profound transformations: the consolidation of the socialist bloc, the nuclear arms race, and the expansion of Soviet maritime presence into distant oceans. It sailed during decades when the world repeatedly stood on the brink of global confrontation. And yet, its guns were never fired in real war. This fact does not diminish its importance, it reinforces it. The ship embodies one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War: power accumulated, displayed, and maintained in readiness, but rarely used in direct combat between superpowers. Yakov Sverdlov was built for a war that never came. By surviving for decades without fighting it, the cruiser became part of the very logic of deterrence itself. By the time the Soviet Union entered the final decades of its existence, the ship had become a living memory of the early Cold War era, a reminder of a time when naval supremacy was still measured in gun turrets, displacement, and visible strength on the horizon. When it was finally decommissioned and sent for dismantling, it marked more than the physical end of a single hull. It represented the closing of an entire chapter in global naval history. Yet one essential question remains: how the Sverdlov-class, led by Yakov Sverdlov, influenced the later development of the Soviet Navy, and what its true legacy was within the broader evolution of 20th-century naval warfare. When we analyze the legacy of Yakov Sverdlov within Soviet naval history, it becomes clear that its importance extends far beyond its years of active service at sea. The ship represented both the culmination of a naval philosophy shaped under the shadow of the Second World War and, at the same time, the final great expression of an era dominated by heavy naval artillery. The Sverdlov-class became the largest series of gun cruisers constructed in the post-war period. That fact alone reveals the scale of the Soviet commitment to this concept. As the lead ship, Yakov Sverdlov established the structural, technical, and organizational standard that defined the rest of the class. But what exactly was its lasting legacy? First, it helped consolidate Soviet industrial capability in building large modern combat vessels in series production. The experience gained from constructing Yakov Sverdlov and its sister ships strengthened shipyards, logistical networks, and naval engineering teams. This foundation proved essential in later decades, when the Soviet Union began developing missile cruisers, specialized anti-submarine ships, and increasingly complex naval platforms. Second, it contributed to doctrinal development. Fleet exercises conducted with Yakov Sverdlov helped shape command procedures, squadron coordination, and the integration of electronic systems at sea. Even as Soviet naval strategy shifted toward missiles and submarines, the operational knowledge gained from managing large surface combatants remained invaluable. Third, there was the psychological and diplomatic dimension. During the early Cold War, the mere existence of cruisers like Yakov Sverdlov reinforced the perception that the Soviet Union could compete with Western naval powers. Power projection depended not only on combat capability, but also on international perception. A cruiser appearing on the horizon carried political meaning as much as military significance. Yet there is also a deeper, almost philosophical aspect to its story. Yakov Sverdlov was designed for a conventional fleet war, an expanded continuation of the great surface engagements of the early 20th century. But the Cold War fundamentally redefined conflict itself. Nuclear deterrence made direct confrontation between superpowers increasingly unlikely. Warfare shifted toward proxy conflicts, regional crises, and carefully managed demonstrations of strength. Within this environment, Yakov Sverdlov became an instrument of stability. It remained armed, trained, and ready, yet its greatest contribution was that it never needed to fire its guns in real combat. Its presence helped sustain the strategic balance that kept open war contained. Over time, the Soviet Navy evolved into a far more technological force. Missile cruisers assumed flagship roles. Advanced electronic systems became central to naval doctrine. Heavy gun artillery ceased to occupy the strategic core of maritime warfare. And still, Yakov Sverdlov remained a witness to that transformation. It sailed through the consolidation of the socialist bloc. It operated during intense naval rivalry in the Baltic Sea. It survived post-Stalin strategic reforms and served during the rise of the Soviet Navy as a global ocean-going force. Its retirement symbolically marked the end of the last major generation of large post-war cruisers armed purely with guns. From that point forward, the future belonged to guided missiles, electronic warfare, and nuclear propulsion. Yakov Sverdlov was not defined by epic battles. It did not sink enemy fleets or decide the outcome of wars. Yet its story is deeply revealing. It shows how nations build power based on lessons of the past, even as the future moves in a different direction. The ship represents the moment when the Soviet Union decided that a strong navy was essential to being recognized as a superpower. It represents industrial reconstruction after wartime devastation. And it embodies the transition from the age of naval gun battles to the era of nuclear deterrence. The steel of its hull may have been recycled, its gun turrets dismantled, but its historical significance endures as an essential chapter in 20th-century naval history. There is something profoundly symbolic in the silhouette of Yakov Sverdlov outlined against the cold horizon of the Baltic Sea. The long sweep of its hull, the elevated deck, and the triple gun turrets aligned with almost geometric precision all seem to convey permanence, strength, and continuity. And yet, the ship was built in a moment of deep strategic uncertainty. When Yakov Sverdlov entered service in the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was still defining what it meant to be a naval power in the post-1945 world. Victory over Nazi Germany had secured Soviet dominance on land, but maritime power remained contested territory, largely controlled by the United States and its allies. The construction of the Sverdlov-class was therefore a political statement as much as a military one. It was not merely about coastal defense. It was about demonstrating that the Soviet Union possessed the industrial, technical, and strategic capacity to operate major surface combatants comparable to those of any navy in the world. Yakov Sverdlov was the physical embodiment of that ambition. Its endurance allowed prolonged operations at sea. Its speed, exceeding 32 knots, provided tactical mobility. Its main battery of 152 mm guns delivered significant offensive capability against surface vessels and coastal targets. Its anti-aircraft defenses reflected hard lessons learned during the air wars of the Second World War. But while the cruiser conducted patrols and exercises, the world was rapidly moving toward a new logic of warfare. Soviet nuclear submarines began operating silently beneath deep waters. Missile-armed cruisers and destroyers redefined the meaning of lethal range. The Soviet Union itself invested heavily in weapons systems that would gradually render gun-armed ships increasingly vulnerable. This contradiction lies at the heart of Yakov Sverdlov's legacy. It was both modern and obsolete at the same time. Modern as a symbol of Soviet industrial reconstruction, yet increasingly outdated within the emerging missile age of naval warfare. And still, its presence was never meaningless. Warships are more than weapons platforms. They are instruments of foreign policy. Floating flags. Visible expressions of strategic intent. For decades, Yakov Sverdlov fulfilled precisely that role with quiet discipline. It participated in Baltic exercises, represented the Soviet Navy at official events, and served as a practical training ground for generations of sailors and officers. It became a bridge between inherited naval traditions and future technological innovation. There is something almost poetic in the fact that it never fought a major battle. Built during one of the most tense periods between global superpowers, it sailed through a world permanently on the edge of war, yet never entered open combat. That absence does not signal irrelevance. It reflects the very nature of the Cold War itself. Yakov Sverdlov existed to be ready, to represent, to deter if necessary, to demonstrate that the Soviet Union could build and sustain powerful surface fleets. Its value lay in the possibility of combat, not in its execution. As decades passed and missile-equipped warships assumed strategic prominence, the gun cruiser gradually became a historical symbol within the Soviet Navy itself. Technology moved forward, but Yakov Sverdlov remained a living reminder of a decisive era of reconstruction and assertion. When it finally left active service, there were no dramatic international headlines, no widely publicized ceremonies. Yet quietly, an entire chapter closed. The era of the last great post-war gun cruisers built in significant numbers. Yakov Sverdlov was more than steel and artillery. It was a strategic declaration. A transitional link. Proof that the Soviet Union intended to contest control of the seas, even as the nature of that contest was about to change forever. Looking back at its construction in Leningrad, its commissioning in 1952, its decades of service in the Baltic and its gradual retirement, we understand that its story is not one of spectacular battles, but of transformation. Technological transformation. Doctrinal transformation. Geopolitical transformation. It was born in the echo of the Second World War. It served beneath the shadow of nuclear confrontation. And it disappeared as the missile age definitively reshaped naval warfare. If we closely examine the trajectory of Yakov Sverdlov, it becomes clear that its story is not merely the history of a ship, but of a strategic mindset in transition. It was conceived at a time when naval warfare was still imagined as a surface confrontation, a duel of steel against steel on the horizon. Yet it matured in a world where danger could arrive unseen, fast, and distant, launched from submerged submarines or aircraft far beyond visual range. This transformation fundamentally redefined the meaning of naval power. At the height of the Sverdlov-class era, the Soviet Union was still shaping its identity as an ocean-going power. Historically, Russian military strength had been overwhelmingly continental. Building large gun cruisers was therefore a clear declaration of maritime ambition, a statement that Moscow would not remain solely a land power. Yakov Sverdlov was tangible proof of that intention. It carried not only weapons but a message. Its displacement, commanding silhouette, and ocean-going capability demonstrated that Soviet industry had reached a new level after the devastation of the Second World War. Shipyards once bombed and cities that had endured prolonged sieges were now producing major combat vessels in series. Yet even as the Soviet Union asserted its presence through cruisers like Yakov Sverdlov, the very concept of warfare was evolving. Soviet naval doctrine increasingly shifted toward sea denial, relying on submarines and anti-ship missiles rather than traditional surface dominance. The objective was not necessarily to control the oceans in the same manner as the United States Navy, but to make hostile naval presence dangerously costly. Within this emerging paradigm, gun cruisers became secondary assets, still capable, still respected, but no longer central. And yet, one essential fact remains: Yakov Sverdlov served for decades. It was not rapidly discarded or deemed obsolete overnight. It remained operational because it still possessed purpose, still fulfilled roles, still offered strategic value. Its presence in the Baltic Sea carried clear importance. The region was confined, strategically sensitive, and heavily monitored by NATO forces. In a regional conflict scenario, a cruiser armed with multiple 152mm gun turrets could still exert considerable pressure against coastal targets or opposing surface vessels. Equally important was the human dimension. More than 1,000 sailors served aboard the ship. For each generation that walked its decks, Yakov Sverdlov was more than a strategic instrument. It was a place of life, training, discipline, and professional formation. It trained officers who would later command missile-equipped warships. It educated gunners who would witness the transition from naval artillery to guided launch systems. It functioned as a living academy of Soviet naval tradition. By the time it was finally withdrawn from service, its historical role was already firmly established. It marked the moment when the Soviet Union committed itself to building a powerful surface fleet after the war. It also marked the point at which that very strategy began to be overtaken by the technological revolution of missiles and electronic warfare. Yakov Sverdlov, therefore, stands as a symbol of transition. It was born from the logic of 20th-century fleet battles. It served during the age of nuclear deterrence. And it disappeared as the future shifted toward guided systems and electronic warfare. Its story reminds us that military history is shaped not only by combat, but by preparation, adaptation, and strategic choice. Every warship embodies the worldview of those who built it, and Yakov Sverdlov carried the vision of a Soviet Union determined to be recognized as a global maritime power. The Yakov Sverdlov did not meet its end amid explosions, enemy fire, or a dramatic wartime sinking. Its conclusion was quiet, much like much of the Cold War itself. Yet this silence does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it was a ship built for a conflict that never erupted into direct war between the superpowers. In many ways, that was its greatest mission fulfilled. When Yakov Sverdlov entered service with the Soviet Navy in 1952, the world was divided by an invisible but profound line. On one side stood the United States and its allies, on the other the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc. The oceans became an extension of that division. Every warship launched carried strategic meaning. As the lead ship of Project 68 bis, Yakov Sverdlov embodied the Soviet determination to rebuild naval strength after the devastation of the Second World War. It symbolized the industrial recovery of Leningrad, the reorganization of naval doctrine, and the ambition to compete for influence across the world's seas. Its 152mm guns were a direct inheritance from the naval battles of the past. Its heavily built structure reflected hard lessons learned in global conflict. Yet its operational life unfolded in an entirely new reality, one defined by nuclear deterrence, constant surveillance, and fragile balances of power. The cruiser sailed through the consolidation of the Cold War. It witnessed the transformation of the Soviet Navy into a global ocean-going force. It saw the rise of nuclear submarines, long-range anti-ship missiles, and electronic systems that fundamentally reshaped naval warfare. And despite these changes, it remained relevant for decades. Because ships like Yakov Sverdlov were never merely instruments of combat. They were instruments of presence, physical demonstrations of power, visible affirmations of sovereignty and industrial capability. Each time it left port, it carried not only its crew, but the symbolic weight of an emerging superpower. Its retirement marked the closing of an era, the era of large post-war gun cruisers built in series. The future would belong to guided missiles, electronic warfare, and nuclear propulsion. Naval power was becoming more technological, more automated, and more lethal, less dependent on the thunder of naval artillery. Yet something endures. Yakov Sverdlov represents the moment when the Soviet Union decided it had to be taken seriously at sea. It stands as a bridge between two military worlds. It reminds us that naval history is shaped not only by decisive battles, but by preparation, adaptation, and the projection of strength. It was born in the shadow of the Second World War. It served under the constant tension of nuclear confrontation. and it ended its journey as a witness to global transformation. Its story reminds us that every ship reflects the era in which it was built, the hopes, fears, and strategies of the nation behind it. And above all, Yakov Sverdlov remained a symbol of maritime ambition in an age of profound uncertainty. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Cold War naval history and want to continue exploring the ships, battles, and strategic decisions that shaped the modern world, be sure to leave a like on the video. It helps the channel continue producing long-form, carefully researched historical content. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss upcoming full documentaries on real naval and military history. Here we go beyond the surface, exploring context, strategy, and the human dimension behind every steel hull. See you in the next chapter of history.